Hey everybody, Brant Frost here. I want to talk. Brad Barnes and I have talked many times, both and through offline and online, and I always enjoy talking to Brad because he has a very interesting perspective. We love talking about history and election statistics, and up at where Brad's from in his part of the state, they've had some really interesting people, not just Marjorie Greene. The whole world knows Marjorie Taylor Greene, but they've had some interesting iconoclast folks who were cut from the same kind of populist
Yeah, going all the way
cloth.
back to the
Going,
1800s.
yeah, going back to the 1800s. Back in the day, and I was actually looking it up. Um, you had Larry McDonald, the great
Hmm.
constitutionalist Democrat from back in the day. And I actually looked it up, Brad. You live in Rome, and I looked it up. It's interesting. Larry McDonald had a lot of support up in North Georgia, way up there in the up near Whitfield County, Dade County, where Colt Moore's from. He had
Right.
support in Cobb County. But wouldn't you know it, Rome, Georgia, where you're from, I remember we were talking about this earlier. You were telling me how Rome has always had kind of some establishment people who live there. And sure enough, Larry McDonald lost Rome in the Democrat primary. He lost Floyd County in the Democrat primary, and he lost it when he first ran, and he lost it in the general election to a Republican who was running as kind of a Chamber of Commerce guy. So the Rome establishment is very
Right.
strong because
We have our own little oligarchy up here,
yeah, yeah. I mean,
going
it's
all the way
crazy.
back to the 1800s even.
But you twice when you ran for office, you stood up against that old oligarchy. You ran against
Right.
Katie Dempsey, trying to give people a choice, trying to give people
Right.
a choice, not an echo.
A
That's
Northwest Georgia populist in the
yeah,
vein
that
of a
could
long history of them.
yeah
And it's
they do
interesting, Marjorie and I were the only ones, for example, to come out and speak against the removal of the Confederate statues. And we warned them that it wouldn't stop there. And lo and behold, the leftist cultural revolution then came for Washington and Jefferson and all of the historical figures, because it's all based on resentment and hatred of our country and culture, and has nothing to do with race, actually.
sweep. They just want to eliminate everything and start over.
And year
Year
zero.
zero. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you see that all over, whether it's the Chinese and the Cultural Revolution and Mao, and it's whether it's the 1968
Yeah.
revolutions in France, where they
Hmm.
one of the 68 the 68ers. I can't remember what they call it in France, but it's the 68ers. And just like in America,
I
1968,
was about
a
to say
huge
68 was a kind of a year sort of like 1848, where there was an outbreak of leftism across, the whole
or
Western world.
1918 in
Right.
Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution and the revolutions that started spreading all across the world. 1918, 1919 were major years of revolution all across
Man, that
Europe.
that
It was
backfired
crazy.
on British intelligence and the New York oligarchs that
Well,
funded the.
the Germans put
Yeah.
Lenin on a train.
Yep.
He was in Switzerland. The Germans
Hmm.
allowed him to go through Germany on the train, put him on a train, let him go through Germany and get to Leningrad. And if they hadn't done that, they did that specifically to break Russia, so that the
Right.
Russians would leave. The Russians would leave the First World War, not the second. The Russians would
Right.
leave the First World War because when the Tsar abdicated, the initial government, the initial leftist social democrat government under Kerensky, was willing to continue the war, but the Germans naturally wanted the Russians out of the war. So they said, okay, let's send this hand grenade, this poison chalice, Lenin. Let's let him go to Russia. Maybe he'll cause
Right.
some trouble. Maybe we'll get him out of the war. We don't know. Of course, it turned out that that was one of the worst decisions. They couldn't have
In
realized it.
history. Yeah.
It was one of the worst decisions they ever made. And of
And
course,
we still live in the echoes of it.
yeah, Germany, 30 years later, when the Russians came in and wrecked Germany, sacked Berlin, and just raped their way across Eastern Europe, the Bolsheviks did it then. But it all goes back to when the Germans allowed that, and that's just one of the fun things. Anyone who knows you, Brad, just will knows you have something interesting to say, and you have an appreciation of history, which I really appreciate. because if you don't know where you've been, you
Right.
don't know where you're going. And like they say, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
Right.
And if you, and we, I think it was Mark Twain who said, "History doesn't rhyme, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes."
Yeah.
And
He was always, he's one historical figure I would have enjoyed spending an afternoon with.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
he
me
always
too.
had a witty
Mark
way with
Twain and H.L. Mencken. Mark Twain and H.L. Mencken would have been great to
right.
spend an afternoon with. It's like Macon said once about democracy. He said, "Democracy is the belief that people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard."
People do deserve what they vote for. You know, and we had our own kind of H.L. Meakin type figure in Northwest Georgia. We had Bill Arp, who was popular in, like, I think the early 1900s from Cartersville, but got syndicated all over the state and I think all over the South even.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing about him, and and the and the people may a lot of people may wonder. Other than I know people are going to enjoy. I think watching this interview because a lot of times it gets really
Right.
wooden or really boring. But it's not just about, oh, it's fun to talk and talk about something beyond just, oh, we're going to do this thing politically. There's a method to it and there's an importance to it because when you're dealing in politics, so much of the decision making process is about knowing something beyond, like, oh, I've got this great new idea. But you need someone, whether it's a second vice chair or whatever role you end up serving in for the next few years. It's important to have at least somebody around who can say, oh, someone tried that before and it didn't work out real well. We have a lot of times without someone around who knows something about the history of the situation. It is so easy to fall into mistakes. Wouldn't have been wonderful in retrospect if there had been someone advising President Bush in 2002 leading up to the Iraq War. It's like, Mr. President, uh, this sort of thing has never worked in that part of the world. We really ought not to try to make a Jeffersonian democracy in the Middle East. They really don't have a history of that. You know, we can't transplant the Jefferson Shenandoah Valley,
Mhm.
Jeffersonian democracy from the Shenandoah Valley. We really can't transplant the Shenandoah Valley and drop it into the Mesopotamia Valley.
Right. I mean, well, you know, you can point out for folks that the U.S. Constitution is almost word for word copied in the Liberian Constitution, yet, you know, Liberia is, you know, not America in terms of its stability.
Yeah.
So, you know,
You can't just copy and paste a document. That's a very good point. Liberia's
right.
constitution, so many constitutions around the world are copied from the United States, but you can't just copy the documents and just copy and paste
Apparently, people matter and people are not, like
history.
liberalism says,
History.
replaceable cogs. You know,
Yeah,
people actually are
history matters. History
right,
matters. And if you look at the United States and our Constitution, our traditions, it takes over it's 1,000 years,
right,
almost 1,000 years of English traditions, common law, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and then the English tradition, the debate between the Parliament and the King, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. You have all of these things leading up to America, and you can't just copy and paste the end result and say, "Oh, this will work fine anywhere else." Everyone has their own history, their own ways of doing things, and you can't just copy and paste. You have to have an understanding of what's happened in the past and what works and what doesn't work.
right. Well, a
And
nation is its people. It's not the
yeah,
rocks that it's founded upon.
and I think that it's amazing that it's just interesting. I find it very interesting that um, of all the new candidates running, because I've enjoyed talking with for a lot of these things with some folks through the years who've served in the past. Um, and I won't mention any names. This is your time, but there are some other individuals who are currently serving in some roles in the executive committee. who have a history, understanding of history.
Sure.
But I think it's interesting that one of the things you bring is not only an appreciation of history. It's interesting, uniquely. You not only do you have a great understanding and interest of in history and appreciation of history, but at the same time, you also are one of the only candidates who also understands the power of some of these tools for the future. For
Right.
example, AI has exploded on politics in the last 2 years, absolutely changed so many things. And you've talked about these little things, not just AI, but other things, but these things which are only really available now to us.
Hmm.
And so you have
They're
both the
they're great.
understanding of history and the things about the future.
They're great force multipliers. Actually, Brant and I recently had a conversation where he was talking about his role in the resolutions committee and how, hours of work was simplified by having something like a chat GPT to help synthesize the resolutions. And there's so many, you know, AI tools that are free out there that we could be teaching our folks how to use to extend
Exactly.
their reach and act as a force multiplier. And there's so many tools that we could do at the state party level that would extend the reach of our volunteers and our county parties, things like email blasts, text messaging, just mundane things, even rather than having 159 county parties try to figure it out on their own, because people have a limited time that they can volunteer. So we want to be able to have kind of turnkey solutions where we make it as easy as possible to be as impactful as possible at the state party level. And part of that is not just building that tool and infrastructure, but training folks how to use them and how to fit that in their strategic vision of what they want to accomplish, say as county parties or the House caucus or whatever. So one of the things I'd like to do is next year we don't have a party um, convention scheduled, but I'd like to have a party conference where, maybe about May, we get everyone together and have different training tracks based on folks' interest. And then we set goals of what it's going to take to get to the goal of winning the governorship, extending our margins in the House and Senate, and defeating Ossoff, and what each player in the process needs to do week by week between then and November to make that win possible. Because we're not going to have Donald Trump on the ballot next year. We're not going to have Trump Force 47. We've got to build our own, Georgia Force 26 from the ground up to do that. And so we've got basically a year between now and then to kind of get the infrastructure in place. I'd like to see stuff like quarterly retreats for the chairs and possibly quarterly retreats where we do candidate development. Because I think a lot of times,
Great point. Well,
yeah,
if I could
yeah,
go back to the call to your idea about the conference, that's a great idea. And again, and the reason I say that is because I've experienced it in last year in January of 2024. Turning Point USA brought about 200 county
hmm,
chairs from the swing states together in Las
right.
Vegas,
I remember that.
and they had this get together and they were saying, and they had these booklets, and they say, we want to help you. And it was right before Ronna McDaniel left and Watley came in. It was the last, in many ways, it was the last nail in the coffin for Ronna McDaniel, because the Charlie Kirk was basically saying, this is how we should do it. And rather than tell you what we should do, we're going to show you and we're going to do it.
Hmm.
And that was a great get together,
Yep.
and it had some great elements that you really can't replicate at a convention. We weren't electing anyone, so there was no campaigning. There was no, oh, I'm on this team and you're on that team. There was no debate over rules or resolutions or platforms. And we all pretty much agreed, 99% of the people there agreed on 95% of
Hmm.
of the, not just the issues, but okay, the strategies and such. And but because we weren't having elections and we weren't debating resolutions or rules, we were a group, we were all just hanging out and talking about how we're going to win elections, and it was great.
Hmm.
We went to these workout sessions, these workout breakout sessions. We went to these breakout sessions, and everything, and it was such a wonderful experience. We
Hmm.
could do something like you're saying here
Right.
in Georgia, the same kind of model where we're all getting to, and the truth is, most of the time, most of us county chairs and officers and volunteers, we hang out and we have a great time. It's
Right.
when we have to get to the elections part, and not like winning the general election, but like the
Party
party officer elections, whether it's local or state or district or state. That's where things get difficult. That's where we people can get real territorial on signal chats and such.
Yeah.
But when we're just talking about how to beat Democrats and the mechanics of how to do that, we can have a grand old time of fellowship and working together. And we definitely need stuff like that. So what you're saying is such a great idea. We definitely need something like that.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of inter-party fighting over the years, so that I think having a strategic plan that everyone can feel a part of could go a long way to giving folks things to do besides infighting. You know, we need less infighting and more fighting the Democrats in our party.
Having statewide get-togethers that weren't focused around
Right.
that weren't just focused around, okay, we're going to have, I mean, in theory, it's great. Like, oh, we get together, we're going to elect our leadership, but kind of in many ways, the practical kind of like how it actually works out in practice is, okay, we're all going to get together and the lead up to this is we're all going to get together. And for months leading up to this, we've been tearing each other to shreds. And then we get together in person and we actually, and we had this big fight and this big, it would be nice to have some statewide get together that did not involve us gutting each other like a fish, gutting each other like a fish
I
for
mean,
3 months
there's
leading
very
up to
little
it.
time to enjoy yourself when it's all raw politics. So,
Yeah.
there's the
Yeah.
people that are really into the resolutions or the rules or, helping particular candidates run or, managing, having separate delegate and alternate. One thing that you and I agree on is,
For 4 months we rub each other's nerves raw, and then we all get
right,
together for 3 months of rubbing each other's nerves raw, and then 3 days we're all together.
right,
It's great.
exactly. And so, even quarterly retreats would be a good
Yeah.
model to kind of test some of the training instead of putting all the eggs in one basket in that conference, between now and then, and doing candidate development. So, I was saying, I think the grassroots is a lot of times at odds with some of the folks that we're having in as candidates going into the state house and state senate. I think having more opportunities for the grassroots to engage in candidate development would help ease some of those tensions as well. And I think that would help with party unity as well.
I could see Cliff Maloney, who was instrumental in working with Scott Pressler in Pennsylvania during the last election. He's worked with many candidates through the years, helping them run in primaries. I could imagine a great deal of interest if in one of these quarterly conference get-togethers, we have someone like Cliff come down and talk about, well, you're a county chair, Mr. or Jones or Miss Smith. You're a county chair. You know all these people. You've volunteered a lot of your time. Maybe you should run for office. And let me tell you, and we're going to spend an afternoon just telling you about, well, how you could do that. We're going to tell you about the 4 or 5 basic things about how you could run for office. And all these candidates. You know that, these legislators, they're flesh and blood people. They put their pants on like everyone else, and there's nothing special about them. Why don't you run for office? Many of our county chairs have run for office and been elected to the legislature, and
Mm-hmm.
many have run and have not been elected to the legislature. But why? But we should see a lot more of that. We should see a lot more people run. There's a Representative Hagan from down in the Toombs County area. She was elected to the
Mm-hmm.
state house, and there's also been county chairs who ran and who weren't elected. But we should have a lot more people running. If we have, let's say, we've got Bethany Ballard, who was a district chair, she was elected to the state house. If we've had, let's say, in the last 10 years, if we've had, let's say, 20 chairs run for office and 10 were elected, we should have 60 or 80 run and we should have 50 elected. We should
Mm-hmm.
have a lot more running and a lot more, and the winning margin and the number who wins should be a lot higher. And there's no reason why we can't prepare them, train
Right.
them, as you've said, for the time when, oh, there's a vacancy, not necessarily challenging incumbents, although many
Right.
incumbents need to be replaced, um, but just preparing them for that moment when,
Right.
oh, there's a vacancy, you should step up and run for it.
And look, that's really the easiest way to keep people honest and accountable in the General Assembly is knowing that there are people that are prepared to run and know how to run. So if they kind of drop the ball, they're going to create an opportunity there. And you do want a certain amount of engagement, because if you don't have anyone running and winning, then you start to get the kind of separation that we have now between the party and the elected leadership that's kind of been a growing gulf over the last 8 years. The base has become highly populist, highly paleo-conservative, and you still have kind of the long tail of neoconservatism in a lot of these offices still.
Well, I can think of few things that would be more interesting and I think would make a more interesting afternoon than having at once a year at one of those quarterly state committee meetings or county chair conferences or combining them together and having someone like Cliff, who's trained so many candidates and was so instrumental in helping President Trump win Pennsylvania, come down and just talk to folks and say, look, you're all county chairs, state committee members. You've known these elected officials. Uh, you know they're human beings like just like you. You should know. Why don't you run for office? There's always an opportunity and to serve in some to run for office, and we'll show you how to do it and have one of those breakout sessions. Be Cliff or someone like him, just talking to folks about, look, these are the things you do, and this is how you do it. And any one of those things, we have a breakout session about fundraising, a breakout session about treasury work, a breakout session about running for office.
Mhm.
I can't think of anything more useful, a few things more useful for a accountant to have 200 county chairs or former county chairs around the state who know how to run for office. And when the moment comes, they run and they could get elected and become a great conservative legislator
And,
or
and
what
you
have
can even build a lot of those skills into just fundraising in general,
you.
just
Exactly.
voter engagement in general, so that it's widely applicable skills that need to be diffused within the party.
Exactly.
Even if it's not directly getting ready for an imminent run, it's going to serve the county parties, the district parties very well, to have those skill sets out there. I mean, because we need to do everything we
To either
can
run or to run a campaign or to help someone get elected.
right, or even build the party infrastructure, because we need to do whatever we can to strengthen the party and make things easier to get things done. Because I mean, we're facing a huge challenge
Well, that's what I
from
meant by run a campaign, help people, help the
right.
party, help your local party.
I mean, it's you can learn a lot of very expensive lessons running a campaign, or you can be trained in all those things and avoid. You can see that the stove is hot, be told that the stove is hot, or you can touch the stove. And we'd much rather people be told the stove is hot than to touch the stove and burn themselves.
Benjamin Franklin talked about that, how people attribute the famous quote about experience is the best teacher to Franklin, but actually what he said was experience is a teacher most dear, and not dear as in your dear wife or your dear child, someone you love dearly, dear as in expensive, painful. Nowadays we would say to translate his statement in the 1700s into modern terms, you'd say experience is a teacher most expensive and
Yes.
costly.
Hmm.
We
and,
should
and
find a cheaper way to learn.
we're facing a huge Democrat onslaught. We don't have the spending to have expensive lessons learned. We need to teach each other, what needs to be taught
And yes, and as fast and as cheaply as possible. So
with AI, maybe.
exactly. Well, you mentioned about resolutions. Yeah, I've seen hours of work cut down to minutes
Mhm.
with these new little technologies, which really are incredibly easy to learn. And if in the next 2 years you have taught people in whatever role you're serving in, if you have taught 50, 100 county chairs in these get-togethers, these conferences, if you have taught them how to use these bots and these little AI tools and save them and do in minutes or seconds what took hours before, you will have done more to help our party and our grassroots than all but 10 people in the last 10 years. There's a handful of people in the last decade who have made a massive difference. And you will have been one of those people if all you have done is just teach them how to do in minutes what takes hours before, you will have made a huge difference.
I agree.
And you meaning you, Brad Barnes. If whatever role you're serving in, whether it's second vice chair or chairman of this task force to train people, you will have made a huge difference. So I'm just thankful that we have people willing to step forward who have the breadth of experience, the breadth of ideas, the breadth of historical knowledge that guys like you do. And it's just fun to hang out and talk with you.
Absolutely. I mean, Brett is one of the most consequential second vice chairs of all time. I mean, he's kind of a legend. Much better than some second vice chairs, we'll say.
Well, I appreciate that, but legend, legendary in both directions. You know, you can be legendarily liked or legendarily hated, but
That's
it's like
true.
Andrew Jackson. I kind of feel like Andrew Jackson or Donald Trump in this regard. People either love me or hate me, but there's no moderate position.
Right. I tend to be polarizing too. I have people that are fanatical fans and then people that just can't stand Brad Barnes. So,
Andrew
I feel you on that.
Andrew Jackson was the kind of president and the kind of man, if you go back and read about him, he was definitely he was America's first polarizing political figure who everyone either loved or hated. There were others, before him, Thomas Jefferson had his many fans and his many detractors, but there is no president comparable to Andrew Jackson in terms of how people loved or hated up until that point. All the partisanship, all the whatever up until that point pales in comparison to what Jackson to the age of Andrew Jackson. And so I can we can all identify with Andrew Jackson in that regard in some moments to
For
the
sure.
degree to which to the degree to which he the age of Jackson. No other president has had that. The age of Jackson.
The Jacksonian age. Yeah.
Although I think maybe the age of Trump may be the next.
They,
I think
they
people
both
look
have
back.
in common that they're their own men and they're men of depth. They're not just, riding the wave of getting a title. And I think we need more of that. I'm not looking to get a title. I'm looking to build a movement to take back and reclaim our country and restore our country.
Well, that's very well put. How can people get in touch with you in the last two
So,
minutes of our chat? How can people get in touch with you?
so we've timed this well. So the best way is by email or by social media. Email is mail@bradbarnes.us. And my social media on Facebook and all the other platforms is Brad Barnes GA, all is one word. And
Excellent.
so thank you so much for your time, Brant. And I hope to see many of the delegates at the state convention. So if you want a bigger and bolder GOP, bet on Brad Barnes. I'm the man for the job. Thank you so much.